blood stained the snowy floorboards of cabin 42. 6 heavily armed operatives had breached the perimeter, expecting an easy kill. They forgot one crucial detail. Valerie Jensen wasn't just a newly minted female Navy SEAL. She was a lethal close-quarters combat instructor, and she had warned them. High in the unforgiving peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho, the temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees below zero. Ice hung heavily from the branches of ancient pines, and a thick blanket of untouched snow covered the rugged terrain. To the untrained eye, the landscape was a frozen, lifeless void, but through the green-tinted lenses of panoramic night vision goggles, Commander Declan Rossi saw exactly what he was looking for. A faint thermal bloom radiating from the chimney of an isolated hunting cabin. Rossi signaled with a sharply angled hand gesture. Behind him, 5 elite operators spread out into a tactical wedge formation. These were not rank-and-file soldiers. They were a specialized, off-the-books extraction team composed of former Tier 1 operators, men who had spent their entire adult lives conducting black ops from the dusty streets of Fallujah to the remote valleys of Afghanistan. Cameron Miller took the point, his suppressed HK Feuerstein rifle raised and locked into his shoulder. Wyatt Henderson covered the rear flank, while Jenkins, their designated marksman, broke off to find a high vantage point on a nearby ridge. Their target was sitting alone in that cabin. Her name was Valerie Jensen. 2 years ago, Valerie had made headlines within the classified echelons of the Pentagon. She had shattered one of the military's most daunting glass ceilings by becoming one of the first female Navy SEALs, earning her trident through sheer, unadulterated grit. But before she ever set foot on the grinding sands of Coronado for BUD/training, Valerie had spent 8 years in the United States Marine Corps. She hadn't just been a Marine. She had been a chief instructor for the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, MCMAP, a true combat master, possessing black belts in multiple disciplines and specializing in lethal hand-to-hand engagements, edge weapon defense, and asymmetrical guerrilla tactics. Rossi and his men, however, only saw a loose end. 3 weeks prior, during a highly classified Joint Task Force operation in Damascus, Valerie had uncovered a lucrative arms smuggling ring orchestrated by her own commanding officer, Captain Mitchell Davies. When Valerie refused to look the other way, Davies branded her a rogue operative. He fabricated evidence of treason, burned her clearance, and hired Rossi's private mercenary outfit to ensure she never made it to a congressional hearing. "Target is isolated," Rossi whispered into his throat mic, his voice barely a rasp against the biting wind. "No thermal signatures detected in the immediate tree line. She's tucked in tight, standard breach and clear. Non-permissive. Leave nothing behind." "Copy that, boss," Miller replied, his boots crunching softly against the powder as he closed the distance to the cabin's western wall. Inside the cabin, the fire on the hearth had died down to glowing orange embers. Valerie sat cross-legged in the center of the room, entirely shrouded in darkness. She had known they were coming. The moment the encrypted burner phone in her go-bag lost its signal, she recognized the telltale signs of a localized cell tower jammer. Captain Davies was thorough, but he was also predictable. Valerie wore a lightweight, insulated tactical suit, stripped of any cumbersome gear that would restrict her mobility. A customized Ka-Bar combat knife rested across her knees, its matte black blade absorbing the faint light of the coals. In her hands, she held the short-wave analog radio she had salvaged from the cabin's basement. She had spent the last 2 hours wiring it to bypass their jamming frequencies, tapping directly into the localized tactical channel Rossi's team was using. She reached out and pressed the transmission button. Outside, Rossi's earpiece suddenly crackled with sharp static, followed by a calm, eerily steady female voice. "Rossi, I know Davies sent you. You have exactly 1 chance to turn your men around and walk down this mountain." Rossi froze, raising a clenched fist to halt his team. Miller pressed his back against the frozen logs of the cabin's exterior, his eyes darting frantically toward the tree line. Trace that signal, Rossi hissed to his communications specialist, a towering man named Dominic Reed. Don't bother, Reed. Valerie's voice echoed through their earpieces, sending a chill down Rossi's spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. I'm broadcasting on a bounce. Listen to me very carefully. You boys rely on your optics, your suppressed rifles, and your numbers. But in close quarters, in the dark, a rifle is just a club. I warned Davies, and now I am warning you. I'm a Marine combat master. If you breach that door, you belong to me. Rossi scoffed, his ego blinding his tactical judgment. He had led raids against entrenched insurgent strongholds. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a single woman cornered in a wooden box, regardless of her resume. Cut the feed, Reed, Rossi barked. He tapped his helmet, signaling the final phase of the assault. Miller, breach it! Go! 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 Miller kicked the heavy oak door squarely next to the locking mechanism. The wood splintered violently, the door crashing inward on its hinges. Instantly, Henderson tossed a flashbang grenade into the center of the room. A blinding white light erupted, accompanied by a deafening concussive crack that rattled the frosted windows. Clear left. Clear right. Pushing forward, the operatives flooded the room, their weapon-mounted lasers cutting through the lingering gray smoke of the stun grenade. They swept the living area, the small kitchenette, and the single ground-floor bedroom in a matter of seconds. The cabin was entirely empty. Boss, Miller said, his voice tight with confusion. Target is not on site. Repeat, target is not in the structure. Rossi stepped over the shattered doorframe, his boots crunching on the glass and splintered wood. He stared at the embers in the fireplace. Sitting perfectly centered on a wooden coffee table was the analog radio, its microphone taped down to an endless loop of static, and a single, rusted Marine Corps pin resting beside it. She hadn't been broadcasting from inside the cabin. She had been outside the entire time. Jenkins, Rossi snapped into his comms, calling his sniper. Do you have eyes on the perimeter? Where did she go? Silence. Jenkins, Sitrep, acknowledge, Rossi demanded, his heart rate spiking as the static hissed in his ear. And there was no response, just the haunting, hollow sound of wind blowing across an open microphone. 200 yards up the eastern ridge, the snow was painted crimson. Jenkins, a veteran marksman who survived 3 deployments in Ramadi, was slumped motionless over his precision rifle. He had never even seen her coming. Valerie had bypassed his thermal optics by wrapping herself in a heavy Mylar survival blanket, crawling at an agonizingly slow pace through the deep snowdrifts until she was directly beneath his sniper hide. When she struck, it was an exercise in flawless, brutal efficiency. A textbook MC map, blood choke from behind, accompanied by a knee strike to the brachial plexus to immediately disrupt his nervous system. Jenkins had lost consciousness in less than 4 seconds. He wasn't dead. Valerie was fighting a defensive war, not a murderous one. But he was bound tightly with zip ties, his radio confiscated, and his optics smashed. Down in the cabin, Rossi's face contorted with rage. Spread out, he ordered. She's in the tree line. 2-man elements. Check your corners. She's got a knife, maybe a sidearm. Do not let her get within arm's reach. Miller and Henderson paired up, stepping cautiously out of the cabin's shattered doorway and into the freezing darkness. The woods were a labyrinth of towering pines and dense snow-covered underbrush. Every shifting shadow looked like a threat. The green glow of their night vision gave the forest a surreal, claustrophobic atmosphere. Keep your spacing, Miller whispered, his eyes scanning the canopy above. She's a SEAL now. She knows how we move. She's a dead woman, Henderson replied, his thumb resting nervously on his rifle's selector switch. They pushed 50 yards north, wading through waist-deep snow. The wind howled, masking the sound of any approaching footsteps. Valerie, however, wasn't approaching them. She was already there. She was crouched atop the thick, sweeping branch of an ancient Douglas fir directly above their patrol path. Her breathing slow and measured, dropping her core temperature and heart rate to practically zero. As Miller passed beneath her, she dropped. She didn't land on her feet. She landed directly onto Miller's shoulders, her thighs locking around his neck in a devastating triangle choke. The sheer kinetic force of her drop sent the heavy operative crashing face first into the deep powder. Before Henderson could even swing his rifle around, Valerie had used Miller's falling momentum to launch herself forward like a coiled spring. Henderson fired a short panic burst, but the suppressed rounds tore harmlessly into the empty air. Valerie was already inside his guard. She didn't try to wrestle his weapon away. Instead, she utilized a foundational Marine combat principle, attacking the weapon's operating system. Her left hand violently slammed the bolt catch of his HK-400 and Stin, intentionally causing a malfunction and jamming the rifle. In the same fluid motion, her right elbow struck upward, connecting sickeningly with the underside of Henderson's jaw. The heavy composite helmet he wore offered no protection against the blunt force trauma to his chin. Henderson staggered backward, his vision swimming. Valerie swept his lead leg, sending him crashing onto his back. Before he could draw his sidearm, she delivered a precise, calculated strike to the carotid artery on the side of his neck. Henderson's eyes rolled back, and he went entirely limp in the snow. Miller, meanwhile, was struggling to rise, his face covered in snow, violently pulling a combat knife from his chest rig. Valerie pivoted, her icy blue eyes locking onto him. Miller lunged forward, executing a wide, desperate slash. Valerie stepped inside the arc of his blade. It was a classic misdirection. She caught his wrist, twisted her hips, and applied a devastating joint lock known in her MC map days as a wakigatami. The sickening pop of Miller's shoulder dislocating echoed sharply through the quiet forest. Miller dropped his knife with a muffled scream, falling to his knees. Valerie clamped a hand over his mouth, dragging him down into the snow until the pain and shock pulled him into unconsciousness. Less than 3 minutes had passed since they left the cabin. Inside the structure, Rossi paced aggressively, checking his tactical wrist monitor. The GPS trackers embedded in Miller and Henderson's gear showed them stationary 50 yards away. "Miller, Henderson, report," Rossi demanded over the comms. "Nothing. Reed, what the hell is happening out there?" Rossi yelled, grabbing the communications specialist by the shoulder. "Are their comms down?" "Their biometric feeds are stable, sir," Reed said, his fingers flying across a ruggedized tablet. "They're alive, that their heart rates are resting. They're unconscious." Rossi's blood ran cold. 3 of his best men, hardened Tier 1 veterans, had been dismantled in absolute silence in less than 5 minutes. They hadn't even managed to trigger a distress signal. "Davis, form up on me," Rossi barked at the last remaining operative in the room. "We're going out there. Reed, you stay here. Keep eyes on the thermals." Rossi and Davis stepped out into the biting wind. The psychological pressure was mounting. They were no longer the hunters. They were being systematically dismantled by an unseen apex predator. They moved with extreme caution, moving tree to tree, their rifles raised, fingers off the triggers but ready to snap into action. Suddenly a loud crackling sound erupted from Rossi's earpiece. It wasn't the sound of static. It was the sound of his own encrypted channel being hijacked. "Rossi," Valerie's voice whispered directly into his ear. The audio was so crisp she sounded like she was standing right behind him. 3 down. 3 to go. You're making too much noise in the snow. Your footing is heavy. You're leading with your ego, not your training. Where are you, you crazy bitch?" Rossi snarled, spinning around in a 360-degree arc, his laser slicing through the dark forest. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied. "But you should be asking yourself a different question. If I can slice through your encrypted comms to talk to you, who else do you think I'm talking to?" Rossi stopped dead in his tracks. A horrifying realization washed over him. The twist wasn't just that she was picking them off one by one. She was playing a much larger game. "Reed," Rossi yelled into his mic. "Check the outgoing uplink. Check the network." Back in the cabin, Reed scrambled over his tablet. Boss, Reed's voice trembled. She didn't just hack our localized channel. She's bridging our comms to an external server. She's recording everything. Our biometric feeds, our GPS locations, your voice. She's live streaming it. To where? Rossi demanded, sweat freezing on his brow. To the Department of Defense Inspector General's secure server, Reed replied, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. And the FBI. She just uploaded the entire unredacted file on Captain Davies' smuggling ring, using our own encrypted mercenary network to bypass his firewalls. We just provided the secure pipeline she needed to whistleblow. Rossi stared out into the dark, silent woods. Valerie Jensen hadn't retreated to this cabin to hide. She had lured them here. She needed their high-grade, off-the-books communication gear to bypass Davies' internal Pentagon blocks. She had used Rossi's elite team not just as target practice, but as her personal IT delivery system. I told you I was a Marine, Valerie's voice echoed in his ear one last time. We don't just win fights. We adapt, improvise, and overcome. Now drop your weapons, or I'll come show you what Chapter 4 of the manual looks like. Rossi's hands shook. He looked at Davis, whose eyes were wide with panic behind his night vision goggles. The woods surrounding them were dead quiet, but the silence had never felt so deafening. The SEALs had closed in, confident and deadly, that the Marine combat master had swallowed them whole. And she wasn't finished yet. The freezing wind whipping through the Bitterroot Mountains sounded like a chorus of screaming phantoms, but Commander Declan Rossi could only hear his own ragged breathing. He stood in the waist-deep snow, his night vision goggles casting the desolate forest in a ghostly luminescent green. Beside him, Davis, his last remaining perimeter operative, swept his rifle in frantic, jerky arcs. The hunter had officially become the hunted. "Boss, we need to exfil, now," Davis stammered, his usual icy demeanor shattered by the psychological weight of the unseen enemy. 3 Tier 1 operators, men who had cleared urban strongholds and survived the most brutal combat theaters on Earth, had been erased in absolute silence. "She used us," Rossi muttered, the sickening realization settling in his gut. Valerie Jensen had never intended to shoot it out with 6 heavily armed mercenaries. She had weaponized their own $1 million encrypted communication array to bypass Captain Mitchell Davies' Pentagon firewalls. The unredacted intelligence cache proving Davies was running an international arms smuggling syndicate was currently flooding the servers of the Department of Defense Inspector General. The mission wasn't just compromised, it was a catastrophic failure. "Fall back to the cabin," Rossi ordered, his voice tight. "We grab Reed, destroy the uplink, and get to the snowmobiles. Move, Davis. Cover our 6. They began a desperate, grueling retreat through the powder. The snow dragged at their boots like wet cement. Every snapping twig or shifting branch made Davis flinch. Valerie wasn't just relying on her SEAL training. She was utilizing the asymmetrical warfare tactics she had mastered as a Marine combat instructor. She understood that fear was a far more effective weapon than bullets. 30 yards from the cabin, the terrain dipped into a shallow, snow-filled ravine. As Davis stepped down into the depression, his boot caught on something buried beneath the powdery length of high-tensile paracord. It wasn't an explosive tripwire, it was a distraction. A heavy pine branch held back by the cord snapped forward with a loud crack, showering Davis with a cascade of ice and pine needles. Davis panicked, his trigger finger spasming. He fired a suppressed burst into the shadows, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the dark woods. "Contact right," he screamed, entirely focused on the swinging branch. He never looked down. Valerie had buried herself in a shallow trencher spider hole directly in their path, using the heavy snowpack to mask her thermal signature. As Davis fired at the phantom threat, the snow at his feet erupted. Valerie surged upward like a coiled viper. Before Davis could redirect his weapon, she seized the barrel of his rifle with her left hand, violently redirecting the muzzle toward the sky. Simultaneously, she stepped deep into his personal space, executing a flawless all-Soto-Gari major outer reaping throw, borrowed from judo and perfected in the Marine Corps martial arts program. She drove her right arm across his throat, while sweeping his planted leg out from under him. The physics were undeniable. Davis, carrying 80 pounds of tactical gear, slammed into the frozen earth with bone-rattling force. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs in a sharp wheeze. Before he could even draw a breath, Valerie dropped her full body weight onto his chest. She executed a crushing knee strike to his floating ribs, followed instantly by a precision edge-of-hand strike to the vagus nerve on the side of his neck. Davis's eyes rolled back, his body going instantly slack. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 seconds. No gunshots, no screams, just the brutal, terrifying efficiency of a true combat master. Rossi whipped around at the muffled thud, but all he saw was Davis lying motionless in the snow. The trench was empty. Valerie had vanished back into the winter abyss as quickly as she had appeared. "Davis," Rossi yelled, abandoning all noise discipline. He backed away, his rifle leveled at the darkness, his hand shaking violently. He turned and sprinted the remaining distance to the cabin, slipping and sliding on the ice-slicked porch. He kicked the splintered door open, desperate for the artificial light and the relative safety of 4 wall. "Reed, pack it up. We are leaving," he roared. The cabin was dead silent. Rossi swept the room with his weapon-mounted laser. The tactical monitors were still glowing, casting an eerie blue light across the log walls. The progress bar on the secure upload read 100% complete. Slumped over the folding tactical table was Dominic Reed. He wasn't dead, but he was incapacitated. A heavy industrial zip tie secured his wrists to the iron legs of the table, and a wide strip of silver duct tape covered his mouth. Rossi's blood ran cold. She hadn't just been in the woods. While Rossi and Davis were pushing toward the perimeter, Valerie had circled back, slipping through the cabin's rear window to neutralize the communication specialist and ensure her upload finished uninterrupted. "Looking for a way out, Commander." The voice came from the shadows near the stone fireplace. Rossi spun, raising his rifle, but the weapon was suddenly heavy. Too heavy. Valerie stepped into the dim light. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding a tactical tablet, Reed's tablet. "Your snowmobiles have been disabled," she said calmly. Her icy blue eyes locked onto his. "I pulled the spark plugs 20 minutes before you even kicked down my door. There is no exfil, Rossi. The upload is done. The FBI's hostage rescue team is already spinning up Blackhawks from a staging ground in Spokane." Rossi let out a guttural scream of frustration. He didn't bother trying to negotiate. He knew his life as a free man was over the second the data hit the Pentagon, but his ego refused to let him surrender to a single operative. He lunged forward, raising his rifle to fire. Valerie didn't retreat. She advanced. As Rossi squeezed the trigger, Valerie sidestepped off the center line. Employing a rapid weapon deflection technique, a left hand slapped the hot receiver of the rifle sideways, sending the burst of suppressed gunfire chewing harmlessly into the wooden floorboards. Closing the distance instantly, she trapped Rossi's rifle against his own body. Rossi was a massive man, easily possessing an 80-pound weight advantage, but Valerie knew that leverage and anatomy dictated the outcome of close-quarters combat, not brute strength. Rossi let go of his rifle and reached for the fixed-blade combat knife strapped to his chest rig. He managed to draw the steel slashing horizontally toward Valerie's throat in a desperate arc. Valerie dropped her elevation, ducking beneath the lethal swing. As the blade passed over her head, she shot upward, driving the crown of her skull directly into the soft tissue under Rossi's chin. The headbutt shattered Rossi's equilibrium. He stumbled backward, his vision flashing white. Valerie seized his extended knife arm. She locked her hands around his wrist, twisted her hips, and applied a devastating standing armbar. With a sickening crack, she hyper-extended Rossi's elbow. The mercenary commander dropped the knife, letting out a howling cry of agony as he fell to his knees. Before he could attempt to counter, Valerie pivoted seamlessly to his back. She snaked her left arm around his thick neck, locking her bicep tight against his carotid artery in a textbook rear-naked choke. Her right hand locked behind his head, pushing forward while her left arm squeezed backward, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. Rossi thrashed wildly, his uninjured hand clawing at her arm, but the grip was like a steel vise. He was suffocating, his massive frame shutting down as the oxygen deprivation set in. 10 seconds later, his eyes fluttered shut, and his body went entirely limp against her. Valerie released the choke and let Rossi slump to the floorboards. She stepped back, her breathing even, her expression entirely neutral. She picked up a bundle of heavy-duty zip ties from Reed's equipment bag and systematically bound Rossi's wrists and ankles. The cabin was finally still, save for the crackle of the dying embers and the hum of the tactical servers. Valerie walked over to the monitors. She tapped a few keys, bringing up the global news feed on the encrypted network. Breaking news banners were already flashing across the screen. Pentagon scandal erupts. Captain Mitchell Davies arrested by federal agents. The trap hadn't just closed on the mountain, it had closed in Washington, D.C. Davies had thought he was sending a cleanup crew to silence a rogue female SEAL. Instead, he had handed a master tactician the exact tools she needed to expose his entire empire. Valerie walked over to the shattered doorway and looked out into the freezing night. The storm was finally beginning to break, the heavy snow clouds parting to reveal a brilliant silver moon in the far distance echoing over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots. She could hear the rhythmic, thunderous chopping of approaching MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. The cavalry wasn't coming to rescue her. They were coming to clean up her mess. Valerie bent down, retrieved her rusted Marine Corps pin from the coffee table, and pinned it securely to her tactical vest. The SEALs had closed in, confident and heavily armed, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their prey. They forgot that before she earned her trident, she had earned her scars in the Corps, and Marine Combat Master never misses a lesson. If Valerie's brutal takedown of an elite hit squad kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe. We bring you the most intense, pulse-pounding military stories and real-life tactical breakdowns every single week. Share this video with your friends who love a jaw-dropping twist, and drop a comment below on what Black Ops story you want to hear next. Stay frosty and